Steve Jobs, fired from Apple to $10 billion comeback. Steve Jobs built Apple from his parents' garage into a billion-dollar empire. Then, in 1985, he was fired from his own company. Humiliated, rejected, kicked out of the business he created with his own hands. Most people thought his career was over. The tech world wrote him off as a one-hit wonder who got too arrogant for his own good. But what happened next became one of the greatest comeback stories in business history. Steve didn't just bounce back. He returned to Apple 12 years later and transformed it into the most valuable company on the planet. He went from sleeping on friends' floors to building a $10 billion personal fortune. But the journey back wasn't easy. It was brutal, humbling, and filled with failures that would have destroyed most people. This is the real story of how Steve Jobs lost everything, rebuilt himself from nothing, and came back to change the world forever. Stay locked in, because this story will blow your mind. Let's rewind to 1985. Apple was on top of the world. The Macintosh had just launched, and even though sales weren't exploding like Steve had hoped, the company was still worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Steve Jobs was 30 years old, rich, famous, and considered a genius. He had everything. But behind the scenes, things were falling apart. Steve had always been difficult to work with. Everyone knew it. He was a perfectionist who demanded the impossible and didn't care whose feelings he hurt in the process. He called people's work garbage to their faces. He screamed at engineers. He made grown men cry in meetings. His intensity had built Apple, but it was also tearing the company apart from the inside. The board of directors was getting nervous. Macintosh sales were disappointing. The company was bleeding money, and Steve's management style was creating chaos. Employees were quitting. Morale was at an all-time low. Something had to change. So Steve made a decision that would haunt him for the next decade. He recruited John Sculley, the CEO of Pepsi, to come run Apple. Steve needed someone with corporate experience, someone who could handle the business side while he focused on products. And he convinced Sculley to join with one of the most famous pitches in business history. Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life? Or do you want to come with me and change the world? Sculley took the job, and at first, everything seemed fine. But within months, the relationship started cracking. Steve and Sculley disagreed on everything: product strategy, company direction, management style. The tension grew. The arguments got worse. And eventually, it came down to a choice. Either Steve stayed or Sculley stayed. But they couldn't both run the company. The board of directors had to pick a side. In May 1985, they voted. And Steve Jobs lost. Then something shifted. Steve realized that getting fired from Apple had actually freed him from something he didn't even know was holding him back: the pressure of success. At Apple, he'd been expected to live up to the myth of Steve Jobs, the boy genius who revolutionized personal computing. Every decision was scrutinized. Every product had to be perfect. The weight of expectations was crushing. But now he had nothing to lose. And that realization changed everything. Within months of leaving Apple, Steve founded a new company called Next Computer. His vision was ambitious: build the most powerful computer ever made, something that would make the Macintosh look like a toy. He poured $12 million of his own money into the project. He hired the best engineers. He designed a computer that was years ahead of its time. But here's the thing about being years ahead of your time: the world isn't always ready for you. Next computers were beautiful. They were powerful. They were revolutionary. They were also incredibly expensive, $6,500 when most computers cost $2,000. And despite Steve's best efforts, Next was a commercial disaster. Universities bought a few. Some research labs picked them up. But the mass market? They didn't care. Next sold only 50,000 computers in its entire run. The company was hemorrhaging money, and once again, Steve Jobs was facing failure. But while Next, the hardware company, was failing, Next, the software company, was quietly building something incredible. The operating system Steve's team developed, Next Step, was unlike anything else on the market. It was elegant, powerful, and ahead of its time. Steve didn't know it yet, but that operating system would eventually become the foundation for everything Apple would build in the future. And then, in 1986, something unexpected happened that would change Steve's life forever. George Lucas, the creator of Star Wars, was going through a divorce and needed to sell off assets. One of those assets was a small computer graphics division at Lucasfilm. Steve Jobs bought it for $10 million. The company was called Pixar. At first, Steve had no idea what to do with Pixar. He thought it would sell high-end computer graphics hardware. But the hardware didn't sell. The company was losing money. For years, Steve kept Pixar alive by pouring his own cash into it. $5 million here, $10 million there. He later admitted he came close to shutting it down multiple times. But a small team at Pixar, led by a brilliant animator named John Lasseter, kept making short films using their technology. Films like Luxo Jr. and Tin Toy. They weren't trying to make money. They were just trying to prove that computer animation could tell emotional stories. And Steve, despite his frustrations with Pixar's finances, saw something in those films. He saw heart. He saw potential. He saw the future. So he kept funding it, even when everyone told him to cut his losses, even when his fortune was dwindling, even when Next was failing and Pixar was bleeding money and his reputation was in tatters. Steve Jobs was in the wilderness, building companies that nobody believed in, spending his fortune on projects that seemed doomed to fail. But he kept going, because he had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Chapter 3: The Pixar Miracle, When Everything Changed. Let's fast forward to 1991. Steve Jobs is 6 years removed from Apple. Next is struggling. Pixar is burning through cash. His personal fortune has dropped from $200 million to around $40 million. Still rich, but nowhere near where he was. And more importantly, his reputation is shot. The tech industry sees him as a has-been, a guy who got lucky once and couldn't replicate it. But then Pixar makes a deal that changes everything. Disney agrees to co-produce a full-length computer-animated film with Pixar. It's a huge risk for both companies. Nobody's ever made a feature-length film entirely with computer animation. Nobody knows if audiences will even watch it. But Steve believes in John Lasseter's vision. He believes in the team, and he's willing to bet everything on it. The film is called Toy Story. For 4 years, Pixar pours everything into making Toy Story a reality. Steve funds the project, even as his accountants tell him he's crazy. Disney executives keep questioning whether computer animation can carry a 90-minute story. There are moments when it looks like the whole thing will collapse. But in November 1995, Toy Story hits theaters. And it's a phenomenon. Critics love it. Audiences love it. Kids and adults are crying in theaters over a story about toys coming to life. Toy Story makes $373 million worldwide and becomes the highest-grossing film of the year. It's not just a hit. It's a cultural earthquake that proves computer animation is the future of filmmaking. 1 week after Toy Story's release, Pixar goes public. The stock explodes. On the first day of trading, Pixar's value hits $1.5 billion. Steve Jobs, who owns 80% of the company, watches his net worth jump from $40 million to over $1 billion in a single day. Suddenly, Steve Jobs is back. Not as the guy who got fired from Apple. Not as the founder of a failing computer company. But as the visionary behind the hottest entertainment company in the world. But here's what's incredible. Steve didn't celebrate by throwing parties or buying yachts. He didn't gloat about his comeback. Instead, he did something unexpected. He started thinking about Apple. Because while Steve was in the wilderness building Next and Pixar, Apple had been falling apart. After Steve left in 1985, Apple's innovation died. The company released boring, uninspired products. Market share dropped. Microsoft was dominating. By 1996, Apple was on the verge of bankruptcy. The board had cycled through multiple CEOs, and none of them could save the company. Apple was dying, and everyone knew it. And then Apple made a decision that shocked the tech world. In December 1996, Apple announced it was buying Next for $429 million. The deal brought Steve Jobs back to Apple as an advisor. Nobody thought much of it at first. It seemed like Apple was just buying Next's operating system because they'd failed to develop their own. But something else came with that deal. Something nobody expected. Steve Jobs was coming home. Chapter 4: The Return, Taking Back What Was His. When Steve Jobs walked back into Apple in early 1997, the company was in shambles. It had 90 days of cash left before bankruptcy. The product line was a mess. Dozens of confusing computers that nobody wanted to buy. Morale was destroyed. The best employees had already left. Apple, the company Steve built, was a corpse waiting to be buried. Steve was officially just an advisor. Apple had a CEO, Gil Amelio, who was supposed to turn things around. But within months, It became clear that Emilio had no idea what he was doing. The board was panicking. Investors were fleeing. Apple needed a miracle. And in July 1997, the board made a desperate move. They fired Emilio and begged Steve Jobs to take over as interim CEO. Steve agreed, but he had conditions. He demanded total control. No interference from the board. No second-guessing his decisions. If they wanted him to save Apple, they had to let him do it his way. The board agreed. They had no choice. Steve Jobs was back in charge of Apple. 12 years after being humiliated and fired, he was running the company again. But this time, he wasn't the arrogant 30-year-old who thought he knew everything. He was a 42-year-old man who'd been broken, humbled, and rebuilt. And that made all the difference. Steve's first move was brutal. He looked at Apple's product line, over 40 different models of computers, and made a decision that shocked everyone. He killed almost all of them. We're going to focus on 4 products, Steve announced. 2 desktops and 2 laptops. 1 for consumers, 1 for professionals. That's it. Everything else is gone. Employees were stunned. Board members panicked. But Steve didn't care. He knew that Apple's biggest problem wasn't that they didn't have enough products. It was that they had too many bad products. Simplicity was the answer. Next, Steve did something even more controversial. He called his old rival, Bill Gates, and asked Microsoft for help. Apple needed cash and software support to survive. In August 1997, Steve stood on stage at Macworld and announced that Microsoft was investing $150 million in Apple. The crowd booed. Apple fans were furious. How could Steve make a deal with the enemy? But Steve didn't care about pride. He cared about survival. And that $150 million gave Apple the breathing room it needed to rebuild. Then came the real magic. In 1998, Steve launched the iMac, a colorful, all-in-one computer that looked nothing like any computer on the market. Tech experts mocked it. They said it was a toy. They said nobody would buy a computer that came in bright colors. But consumers loved it. The iMac sold 800,000 units in its first 5 months and single-handedly pulled Apple back from the edge of bankruptcy. Steve had done it. Against all odds, he'd saved Apple from death. But saving the company was just the beginning. The real revolution was still coming. Chapter 5. The products that changed everything. Here's the thing about Steve Jobs' second act at Apple. He didn't just want to save the company. He wanted to redefine what a technology company could be. Between 2001 and 2010, Steve launched a series of products that didn't just change Apple, they changed the entire world. In 2001, the iPod was released. A small, white music player that could hold 1,000 songs. The tech press was skeptical. Why would anyone pay $399 for an MP3 player when there are cheaper ones? They asked. But Steve understood something they didn't. People don't buy technology, they buy experiences. The iPod wasn't just a music player. It was a statement. It was cool. It was simple. And it worked flawlessly. Within 3 years, Apple sold 10 million iPods. The music industry was transformed. Apple became cool again. Then came the iTunes Store in 2003. Steve convinced record labels to sell individual songs for 99 cents. Nobody thought it would work, but it did. iTunes became the biggest music retailer in the world and gave Apple control over digital content distribution. But the real revolution came in 2007. Steve walked on stage at Macworld and said, "Today, we're introducing 3 revolutionary products. An iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator." The crowd cheered. Then Steve smiled and said, "These aren't 3 separate devices. This is one device. And we're calling it iPhone." The iPhone changed everything. It killed the BlackBerry. It forced Nokia into irrelevance. It made smartphones mainstream. And it turned Apple into the most valuable company on earth. In 2010, Steve introduced the iPad, and once again, critics said nobody needed it. It's just a big iPhone, they mocked. But consumers bought 15 million in the first year. Every single product Steve launched after returning to Apple became a cultural phenomenon. And here's what's crazy. None of these products should have existed. If Apple had died in 1997 like everyone expected, there would be no iPod, no iPhone, no iPad. The entire smartphone revolution might have taken years longer to happen. Steve Jobs' comeback didn't just save one company. It changed how billions of people communicate, listen to music, and interact with technology. By 2011, Apple was worth $350 billion. Steve's personal net worth had grown to over $10 billion, making him one of the richest people in America. He'd gone from fired and humiliated to becoming one of the most influential business leaders in history. But the cost of that success was higher than anyone knew. Chapter 6. The Legacy, What We Can Learn. Let's be honest about something. Steve Jobs' comeback story is inspiring, but it's not a fairy tale. Because while Steve was building the future, he was also dying. In 2003, Steve was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. He tried to treat it with alternative medicine and diet changes, refusing surgery for 9 months. By the time he finally agreed to an operation, the cancer had spread. For the next 8 years, Steve battled the disease while simultaneously building Apple into the most valuable company on the planet. In 2011, at the age of 56, Steve Jobs died. He never got to see Apple become a trillion-dollar company. He never got to see the Apple Watch become the best-selling watch in the world. He never got to enjoy the full fruits of his comeback. And that's the hard truth about Steve's story. His greatest comeback ended in tragedy. But here's what we can learn from it. Steve Jobs got fired from his own company at 30 years old. Most people would have given up. Most people would have taken their millions and retired to a beach somewhere. But Steve didn't. He spent 12 years in the wilderness, building companies that failed, investing in projects that lost money, and refusing to quit even when everyone told him he was done. And those 12 years in the wilderness? They weren't wasted. They were necessary. Next's operating system became the foundation for macOS and iOS, the software that runs every Apple device today. Pixar proved that Steve could build a successful company without Apple and gave him the confidence to take big risks when he returned. Getting fired was the best thing that ever happened to Steve Jobs. Not because it felt good, it was humiliating and painful, but because it forced him to start over, to learn humility, to rebuild himself into a better leader. The Steve Jobs who returned to Apple in 1997 was not the same person who got fired in 1985. He was wiser, more patient, more focused. He'd learned that being the smartest person in the room doesn't matter if you can't inspire people to follow your vision. He'd learned that failure isn't the end, it's just part of the process. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Success isn't about never failing. It's about what you do after you fail. Steve could have stayed bitter about getting fired. He could have blamed John Scully and the Apple board for the rest of his life. He could have given up on technology and lived off his fortune. But instead, he built 2 successful companies from scratch, came back to Apple when it was dying, and created products that changed the world. That's not luck. That's resilience. That's vision. That's refusing to let failure define you. Conclusion. So here's the question. If Steve Jobs could come back from being fired, humiliated, and written off as a failure to build a $10 billion fortune and change the world, what's your excuse? Seriously, think about it. What failure in your life feels too big to overcome? What dream did you give up on because someone told you it was impossible? Steve Jobs didn't have some secret advantage. He got knocked down harder than most people ever will. But he got back up. He kept building. He kept creating. And he proved that your biggest failure can become the foundation for your greatest success. Drop a comment and tell me, what's one thing you're going to stop making excuses about and finally commit to? I want to hear your story. And if you're serious about rising after failure, if you want more stories about people who lost everything and came back stronger, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because this channel is all about proving that failure is not the end. It's just the beginning. Steve Jobs lost Apple. Then he built Pixar. Then he saved Apple. Then he changed the world. Your comeback story is waiting. Stop waiting for permission and go write it.